Richard Straker, a businessman who opens a store in the town of Salem's lot, sends Mr. Snow, the man who helps him with the move, to take a box to the Marston house, a house that had been vacant for almost 40 years and was acquired by Straker upon arriving in town. Mr. Snow and his companion take the box to the basement of the house. The box is so heavy that it slips from his companion's hands and breaks, revealing that it is full of dirt. After placing the box in its spot, Snow is momentarily hypnotized as the box opens. His companion interrupts the trance, and they both leave the house, making it clear that what was inside the box was a vampire. And this is how the story begins. Welcome to Random Recaps. In this video, I'm going to recap the movie. The writer Ben Mears returns to his hometown, Jerusalem's Lot, according to him, in search of inspiration. Ben looks for a room to rent during his stay and meets Susan, who tells him where he can find an available room. Ben goes to Eva Miller's to rent a room. At the local school, we meet Mark, a new boy who is being bullied by a kid named Richie, but don't worry, my pal Mark isn't someone to mess with. Teacher Matthew Burke arrives to break up the fight. At the library, Ben researches past events in the town, such as the Marston house, where a tragedy occurred in 1937, and a car accident about 20 years ago caused by a drunk driver who killed his parents in the crash. In the library, Ben runs into Susan, who loudly mentions that she'll be going to the drive-in, hoping Ben overhears. Mark befriends Ralph and Danny. As night falls, the kids decide to head home. Ralph is afraid of the dark, so Mark gives him a harmonica to help him with his breathing and to manage his fear. On their way home, the kids run into Richard, who creepily offers to give them a ride wherever they want. The scared kids decide to walk through the woods to avoid him. Ben goes to the drive-in to meet Susan. There, the two get to know each other better. Susan talks about the people in town and shares things about herself. Meanwhile, Ben tells her that he returned to the town to learn more about it, as he usually writes about other stories but doesn't know much about his own. Night falls, and we see the kids walking through the woods until Richard kidnaps Ralph and takes him to the Marston house. The reason for the abduction is to offer him as a sacrifice to his master, Barlow, the vampire we saw at the beginning of the movie. We can only hear the child's screams as the vampire takes his sacrifice. The next day, we meet Father Callahan, a man who spends his days drinking and doesn't even know how he ended up in jail due to his drunkenness. When the officer, Parkins, releases him, he informs him that Ralph is missing. The townspeople help Danny's family search for Ralph for over a week, but of course, they don't find him. The townspeople start to suspect Ben, except for Burke, who becomes Ben's friend. That night, Danny thinks he sees Ralph in his yard, so he runs to find him. In the yard, he finds Ralph's harmonica, and the seesaw starts moving on its own. As Danny approaches, the vampire grabs him. Danny tells his mother that he isn't feeling well, so his parents take him to the hospital. Dr. Cody tells them that Danny has pernicious anemia. Later, Danny tells his mother that he is thirsty, but the problem is that he doesn't want water, he wants something else. Danny eventually dies due to the lack of blood. The next day is Danny's wake, and the cemetery worker, Mike, falls asleep. He wakes up at night and starts burying the coffin, but Danny is alive and starts calling for help. Mike opens the coffin, only to find Danny with his eyes closed. Thinking it was just his imagination, Mike continues burying the coffin, but then realizes that Danny is no longer there. Mike is attacked. The next day, Burke meets Mike at a bar and notices something strange about him. Mike says he feels sick and can't remember what happened. Burke, seeing him in that condition, offers him a place to stay at his home so they can go to the hospital in the morning. There, Burke finds marks on Mike's neck of Burke, because he already knows he's in trouble. Later, Burke realizes that Mike let someone into the house.
Run, bitch! Run!
Burke goes to Ben for help. Ben was with Susan doing. Burke takes them both to his house, where he explains that he thinks Mike is a vampire. When they arrive, Burke's house is dark. The three of them enter the room where Mike is sleeping. The bite mark is no longer on his neck. According to Burke, a person dies, and the mark disappears before they transform into a vampire, a process that can take minutes or days. Not knowing what to do, they call the police and Dr. Cody. Without telling them, they believe Mike is a vampire. Meanwhile, Danny starts knocking on Mark's window. Mark wakes up, scared to see Danny transformed into a creature. Danny asks for permission to come in. Mark refuses, but Danny hypnotizes him to let him in. Danny gets close, saying that Barlow wants to meet him, but fortunately, Mark has a cross in a model, which he uses to repel Danny. Since Mark isn't afraid of anything, he promises Danny to free him.
I'll set you free, Danny. You have my word.
Because that's what heroes do.
So, he makes a list based on his comics on how to fight vampires and concludes that to save his friend, he has to kill Barlow, the master of the vampires. Burke also researches vampires. In the meantime, Mike, now transformed, approaches him, but luckily, Burke uses the power of Christ to repel Mike. Burke, feeling confident, believes Mike has left the house, but Mike hasn't. Mike asks him to join them because Barlow wants to meet him. He tries to hypnotize Burke, but Burke uses the power of Christ to drive him away from the house. The next day, Dr. Cody is informed that Danny's mother has also died, and she realizes that Mike's body is no longer in the morgue. Cody goes to Burke's house to inform him and finds him on the floor. Burke, Ben, Susan, and Cody gather to discuss how to defeat the vampires. Burke realizes that Richard might be one of the vampires after calling a flower shop to ask for white roses. Roses that can repel vampires. And the shop tells him that a man matching Richard's description took them. Burke believes that the first child was a sacrifice to consecrate the ground for Barlow's arrival, and that the second child is still out there as a vampire. To confirm this, Ben wants to go to the cemetery to see if Danny's body is still there. Cody, skeptical of everything Burke is saying, refuses. She suggests checking Danny's mother's body to see if she turns into a vampire. Burke continues to investigate Barlow and Straker. Meanwhile, Mark, with his massive courage, goes to the Marston house with a stake to save his friend. There, he meets Burke. As Mark tells him that he knows they are dealing with vampires, the two are locked in the basement. They try to find a way out, but then Barlow appears and Mark is captured. Meanwhile, Cody, Ben, and Susan go to check Danny's mother's corpse to see if she's a vampire. When they arrive, the woman starts to move and calls for her son.
Danny, answer me.
They make a cross out of popsicle sticks and bless it by praying, but the vampire manages to break it and attacks Cody. Susan uses adhesive tape to bind the popsicle sticks together, forming a cross, and defeats the vampire. But it's too late because Cody has already been bitten. She injects herself with rabies vaccine, and Ben places the cross on her to make sure she's not a vampire. The three of them go to find Burke, but realize the vampires have already captured him. Mark is tied up, but he manages to escape and defeat Richard. Cody, Ben, and Susan, seeing the power of faith over the vampires, decide to seek Father Callahan's help. At first, he doesn't believe them, but then the Jigachad Mark arrives, telling them that Burke is now one of them. Since Burke is, Jigachad grabs holy water and wants to face Barlow on his own. The father asks him to take him to the place where it all happened. They go to the Marston house, and suddenly, the door to the basement opens by itself. The group decides to go down, and there they find Burke. Ben attacks him with the stake but misses. The priest and Cody open the back door, letting in the sunlight, which harms Burke, and Ben manages to drive the stake through his heart. The group decides to warn the town about the vampires and take shelter in the church before nightfall. Cody warns Parkins, but he's so scared that he decides to leave town. Susan goes to warn her mother, but she finds out that her mother works for Barlow and is attacked by a vampire. Meanwhile, Father Callahan warns Mark's parents, but at that moment, Barlow arrives to attack Mark's family. The father's faith is so weak that the cross doesn't work.
Bruh.
Mark flees his home, chased by the children who have turned into vampires. Ben takes Susan to the church where Cody is waiting. Upon entering, Susan is already starting to transform. Ben asks for help, But Cody, realizing there's no saving her, wants to stake her. Susan escapes the church. Ben follows her and discovers that practically the entire town has turned into vampires. As they run to the church, Cody throws a stake and manages to take down Mike with it. The two enter the church, and the vampires throw Parkins out the window. The next day, taking advantage of the daylight, Ben and Cody wander through the town, hoping someone is still alive. They don't find anyone, but when they go to Mark's house, they find a note from the character with the biggest guts in the movie, saying that he will face Barlow himself. Mark goes alone to Barlow's shop. Upon entering, he cuts himself on the window glass, leaving a trail of blood as he walks. There, he is attacked by Danny. But my buddy Mark can do it all, so he takes down Danny. Ben and Cody meet up with Mark. The group notices there are no cars, so they decide to go to the drive-in to look for Barlow and the other vampires. Ben checks Susan's car trunk and realizes they are using the car trunks as coffins. Cody decides to stake Susan, but Susan's mother arrives just in time to prevent them from harming her. Mark and Ben hide from the woman, but then night falls, and the vampires emerge from their coffins.
We're screwed. Okay, we're screwed.
They are screwed. I don't even know how the goat Mark solves this. Ben is attacked by several vampires and is about to be bitten until Mark gets the idea to break the movie screen, allowing the remaining sunlight to hit and take out the vampires. Mark once again proves to be the goat. Susan's mother shoots Ben, but Mark saves the day once again by running her over. Ben and Mark find Barlow's coffin in a truck and want to use the sun to finish him off. But it's too late because the sun has already set. Ben and Mark hide, but they are attacked by Susan. Ben fights Susan while Mark runs away from Barlow. With a heavy heart, Ben has no choice but to take down Susan. Mark screams for help. Ben pierces Barlow's mouth and then attacks him with the stake. Ben and Mark, being the only survivors, flee the town. And that's how the movie ends.